Hey guys, it's Piper, and yeah, so my last video pissed a lot of people off, and I usually don't care because I'm a massive prick, but I think this is one of those cases where I think partially it's a misunderstanding, and also partially Tumblr people crying because I don't like trigger warnings when I'm such a hypocrite because I disagree with them and use them anyway. Fuck me for trying to be considerate for a change, so well. First, I'm going to explain why I think the art book I'm releasing, 10 Years of Sketching, is a special case and needs a trigger warning, and then I'll delve into the scientific reasons why I'm against them 90% of the time, since a lot of people are curious about why I don't like trigger warnings. And then I'll share my personal experience so I can end on a depressing note as thanks for the fact that I had to make this video to begin with. Now, I already said this in my last video, but I guess I didn't put enough emphasis on it, or it did come kind of late in the video, so I guess a lot of people jumped the gun and commented immediately, being angry or something. But, this isn't a book where I drew a pretty girl who was super skinny one time, and I have to give a trigger warning because I'm afraid it'll hurt someone's fifis. This book borders on glamorizing eating disorders, if it doesn't just straight up glamorize eating disorders. It depicts people purging with the words, "I heart Anna and Mia" right there next to it. Someone suffering puking over a toilet bowl, and that's what I chose to write in the margins next to it. "I heart Anna and Mia." That's pretty fucked up. For those of you who don't know, Anna and Mia are these cutesy nicknames people give their eating disorders. Anna is anorexia and Mia is bulimia. So the average person won't need it, they won't catch it, they won't need the trigger warning, but someone with an eating disorder will know exactly what I'm talking about there. And it's not just one picture either, it's throughout the entire book because of the way it's formatted. I came close to the end of the sketchbook a long time ago, but continued to draw on random pages, so it's not a linear progression of my skill like most people's sketchbooks are. Almost every page is a portrait of that decade of my life. Anorexia, blood, gore. Remember, even though this sketchbook spans across 10 years, I had vision problems for a couple of them, and I couldn't draw for multiple years, and it took me more years to get into sketching again. So mainly this sketchbook covers two phases of my life. When I graduated high school at 17, so I was very young, and then again in my late 20s, aka recently. My more recent sketches have been a little happier, and you'll probably be able to pick them out from my sketchbook based not just on how well they're drawn, but the general attitude. It's a little more hopeful. But when I was in my teen years, things were really dark for me back then. And I wasn't experienced enough to realize that I was wallowing in my mental disorders instead of getting better. In the psych ward, I was treated like I was batshit insane, even though I wasn't. And at a time when I was struggling with who I was, my mental illnesses became my identity, and 10 years of sketching reflects that. Since it possibly glamorizes the pain I went through, I find this one of the cases where people who use trigger warnings properly, which is becoming rarer and rarer nowadays, they need to see it. If someone's trying to recover from an eating disorder and they avoid every mention of it, it will hurt their recovery for reasons I'll mention later. But if they see me blessing the patron saints of Anna and Mia, well, that's not going to help them recover either, and that's why there's a trigger warning. People who seek out trigger warnings because they want to be triggered will do it anyway, so I'm not going to withhold a warning for their sake. Yes, I can be a hypocrite, but this is one of the times where I'm right. People need to know what's in this book, so they can know that I'm not condoning these behaviors, and avoid buying it if they don't like it to begin with. And, let's just be honest, I don't need the negative reviews this early on in my career. We're all built differently, and as for why I mentioned the triggers for cut marks, blood, gore, suicide, that sort of thing, I just figured why the hell not? If I was already going against my beliefs to some extent, I may as well mention the other stuff too. But even so, those things I mentioned, they may not be glamorized. See, I can't talk for shit. But they are very graphic. This isn't just, oh my god, you drew a blood drop and now I'm triggered. This book has some crazy ass shit it. It's not for kids or people in fragile states of mind. And it would be irresponsible for me to just glaze over all this stuff and be like, oh, this is a family-friendly book, you should buy it and support my channel. And also, did I mention the tentacle erotica a couple of times? Come on. I think we need a heads up for that. And, you can't currently preview this book before you buy it because it's on pre-order. And I can't show it here because it's against YouTube's terms of service. So there's really no way to guess what's in 10 Years of Sketching right now until after you buy it and it comes out and it's too late. So by making the trigger warning video, I was trying to avoid that. So if you're really curious and you can't stand waiting, I know I said I refused to censor my work, but here you go. Some very heavily censored pages from my sketchbook. As you can see, I wasn't really happy drawing any of this shit, except maybe the tentacle erotica, the consenticles. I can't believe I accidentally said consenticles instead of consensual. Oh, and that girl with the two-toned hair, that's not Melanie Martinez, for legal reasons. Now, on to the personal experience and science. Let's go with the science first because it's more important. Before making that last video, I actually Googled studies for them to make sure that trigger warnings wouldn't make things worse, and though I did come to the conclusion that my book was a special case because of the glamorization, the studies do show that yes, trigger warnings can coddle the mind. Harvard University recently did a study on this, and they found that trigger warnings undermine emotional resilience and lead to more anxiety rather than less. I'll link the study in the description if you want to read the whole thing, but here's the highlight list they had at the beginning. Trigger warnings increase people's perceived emotional vulnerability to trauma. Trigger warnings increase people's belief that trauma survivors are vulnerable. And trigger warnings increase anxiety to written material perceived as harmful. First, I want to make it clear that a trigger is not just blood or syringes, like Tumblr might make you think, because of the certain things that they usually tag. A trigger is something that reminds someone of a past traumatic experience, even if that something sounds silly to other people. It could be a smell, or a color, anything. Rain on a tin roof, certain flowers that might remind them of something, The idea is that if you warn someone ahead of time, they're going to be more prepared, and that looks great on paper, but it doesn't always play out that way in practice, especially because they're not targeted toward people who have PTSD, usually. They're very overused, particularly on the internet, and it creates this culture of young people who have been falsely led to believe that avoiding their problems will help, when in reality it will only make them feel worse in the long run. And it's usually well intended, but intentions don't change the fact that it's harmful. So the people who are advising against trigger warnings, yeah, some of them are just being jerks and calling everyone a pussy, but that doesn't mean you should ignore all this scientific evidence, Avoidance is not a cure for trauma, it is a symptom of trauma. And that's not just a smart-ass quip. Avoidance is a symptom and diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it doesn't cure it, it makes it worse. When you go into therapy for PTSD, you have to talk about it, you have to face it gradually over time, you have to come up with healthy coping mechanisms, and you can't do that by avoiding things. I'm not saying you should, go through gang territory 5 days after you're discharged from the military because of your PTSD after what happened in Iraq, or something like that. That was weirdly specific, but you get it. Start small. The problem is, most people aren't using trigger warnings properly. They're tagging every tiny thing as TW cutting, and they're not encouraging people to move on. The more you consciously avoid something, the more power you are giving that thing. As usual, Tumblr is full of shit. If something is triggering for you, you don't need to keep avoiding it for the rest of your life. You need to get help so you can move on, because the world isn't filled with psychics who can warn you that you're going to witness a car wreck or accidentally cut yourself chopping vegetables and see all that blood and whatnot. It's impossible to give trigger warnings to satisfy everyone because people going through trauma experience triggers that are completely mundane to everyone else. One of my triggers is mint. The taste, the smell, it all reminds me of my trauma, and there's no way to protect myself from that. I brushed my teeth with kids' toothpaste for years to avoid mint, and it didn't help me move on, it just fucked my teeth. And as I touched on earlier, some people seek out trigger warnings wanting to be triggered. This is maladaptive behavior. It's not really a problem in a classroom environment because, you don't go to class to be triggered. But when you tag something as TW Blood on Tumblr, I guarantee you're going to get a ton of hits from people who just want to bathe in it. Okay, that was worded weirdly. I can already see myself derailing. So in my personal experience, seeking out triggers actually helped me because before I started seeking this stuff out, I was avoiding my trauma. I dissociated from it. I told myself it was just my ex-boyfriend being very rude to me while I was trying to sleep. I even tried to convince myself I wanted it so I could feel in control. And the word assault rarely crossed my mind because I wouldn't let it. And on the rare occasion it did, I was just like, well, that's what I deserve for being such a terrible partner. And this went on for years until suddenly I finally admitted to myself what happened and I exploded. It was after I finished book 1 of Cry for the Devil, coming out late this year. I decided to write a series of prequels for the characters, the villains. You've heard me mention it. One of the characters is dead when Cry for the Devil begins. Her name is Simone. She was gang raped in book 2, which I'm working on now, and in book 3 she kills all of them one by one. Well, in book 2 I don't just gloss over the act. I wrote the most graphic rape scene imaginable. It's horrifying, and the fact that the book is in first person and present tense makes the tension even worse. Because this isn't Simone looking back on her life and you're like, well, everything must have worked out in the end or else she wouldn't be here to tell the story, right? It's Simone narrating while she's experiencing it, and she's terrified because she has no idea what's coming next or if she's going to survive. And as a matter of fact, it is so terrible, I'm probably going to insert a link in the Kindle version that skips to the next chapter if you're currently going through rape trauma syndrome, because I figure why not? Because someone who was sexually assaulted doesn't need to read it. They already know what Simone is going through, and that's why I decided to leave the chapter in, because a lot of readers, they won't understand why she needs her revenge unless they read the moment she was broken. They need to know that she wasn't raped because her skirt was too short. They need to know that she wasn't asking for it because she was drunk. And if I just gloss over that night, a lot of readers will never understand how Simone feels. And this, I've been recording for 15 minutes. Okay, this ended up being way longer than I expected. I thought this video would be like 2 minutes long, and I feel like I've been going on for an hour. Well, my point with all of this is, after I wrote that chapter, that was the point when I started to heal. It was hard, but it got my emotions out. And avoiding triggers, it never did that. I know this because I tried it. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you and good night.